So I can hear you all sitting at home just yelling at me, but all firms don't have the same cost function, right? That's what you've been saying in your head, or yelling out loud at me, throwing things at the screen, saying not all companies are the same. Maybe some firms have relatively low costs and others have higher costs. So let's just take three types of companies. Let's take just three companies, type A, type B, and type C. So what would our aggregate supply schedule look like if these are our individual supply schedules? Well, if this was the price, well, the answer, of course, is it depends on where demand is. So let me put a demand schedule in here, okay? No reason why it looks that way. I've just drawn it in. So what happens? Well, if this is the price, this would be our quantity supplied, and our quantity demanded would be over here on my wall where I'm not going to mark it because then I'm going to have to clean this up when I eventually move out or I lose my security deposit. So, of course, we have a massive shortage in that case. And so what would we expect to happen? We would expect maybe the price to go up, at which point this producer, producer A, produces more. But of course now we still have a shortage. It's gotten smaller, but we still have a shortage. And then, so the price would go up. As soon as the price hits this point here, right? Firm B or individual B is going to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to help out. I'm going to jump into that market, at which point they will produce their minimum quantity here. And what do we have? Here would be our aggregate quantity supplied. This would be the quantity supplied by firm A. This would be the quantity supplied by firm B. But we still have, here would be our quantity demanded at that price. And so we would expect the price to rise. And so when the price rises to here, let's see here. Okay. So this would be our aggregate supply schedule. And then, of course, once the price hits here, we will then have something that looks like that. And so if we clean this up with three firms with different cost functions, we would end up with an aggregate supply schedule that looks like that. Turns out it looks a lot like our regular supply functions. We've got some little things in it. So that's one way. So now if we think about our supply schedule that we've been using up until now, up until this point, with an upward sloping supply schedule, you can view that as either a supply schedule that you use when you just need a quick answer. You could look at it as a supply schedule in the short run, and you could look at it as a supply schedule in markets where imitation is not possible. So in this situation, we end up having positive economic profit that persists. Of course, firm B here is now going to go out and try and find ways, I'm sure, to imitate firm A. And if they do that, then this would shift down like that. And firm C would try and find ways to imitate as well. And so eventually we would expect, right? Now, again, there may be some industries where it is impossible to imitate, but I think people will still put a lot of time and energy towards it. So you think about, there are some industries, music, sports, some other areas where you simply can't imitate. But even there, I'd say a lot of people are putting, young folks are putting a lot of time and energy into practicing to try and become the new LeBron James or something else. Now, whether they'll be able to do that is another question. So that's a case where we can actually use this to look at firms that have different cost functions. Now let's go back to, so hopefully that makes sense. And again, I'm hoping this will trigger some questions for the next class that we meet here. Let's go back to the situation where we have an aggregate supply schedule like this, individual supply schedule like this, and a demand function like this. So we have zero economic profit. We have an upward sloping individual supply schedule, but a horizontal aggregate supply schedule. I probably shouldn't cheat here. We'll do that. So, of course, what happens if one firm figures out a new way to do things? Well, their cost function will shift down, and so they will be this person, at which point, at this price, they will produce this quantity. Everybody else will produce along their supply schedule on this aggregate supply schedule. And so, in effect, our aggregate supply schedule now looks like this. And so we would have this price and this quantity. We would be stable, or we would be at the same market clearing price and quantity. So firms innovating doesn't necessarily mean that the price falls. Is it good that they innovated? Well, consumer surplus before was A, producer surplus before was 0, government before was 0, and total surplus before was A. Now, consumer surplus is still A, so no change in consumer surplus. Producer surplus 2 is B, just the firm that's innovated. Every other firm is making 0 economic profit. Government is 0, and total surplus is A and B. So what's happened? We are better off. We've gained B as a society. It's gone all to the producers, but we as economists don't pick sides. Now, so that's the short run picture. Of course, what happens next? Well, this B, again, it's a big neon sign saying, come copy me. And so other firms are going to figure it out, unless there's some legal restriction from them doing it, and they're going to imitate, at which point our aggregate supply schedule shifts down. At which point, what happens? Producer surplus goes from B to 0. And consumer surplus goes from A to A, B, C, D, and E. Government is 0 before and 0 after. We as a society, as a result of people imitating, have gained C, D, and E. Of course, at that point, the firms in the market are making 0 economic profit. Firm B has a strong incentive to try and keep them from imitating, because that benefit to them is concentrated, whereas the benefit to consumers is spread out across society. So this is a way to model innovation. We want people to innovate. We want people to imitate. And it turns out, let's take a corporate taxation policy that said, as soon as you make positive economic profit, so this producer surplus, B, consumer surplus, A, government, 0, and total surplus, A and B. And so now we look at this and we say, you know what we're going to do? Either because we are Bernie Sanders and we think corporate profit is evil or wrong or socially destructive, or simply because we want to raise government revenue, we now say we are going to take away all of your producer surplus. We're going to tax it away. And consumers here get A, and government now gets B, and total surplus is A and B. So you look at it and you say, well, that's fine, right? It's just a redistribution. And in the short run, that's absolutely correct. The problem, of course, is this B here, before, what was this? This was a big neon sign saying, come copy me. When we take away that neon sign, what happens? Is anybody going to imitate? No, we're never going to have this supply schedule shifted down, because that profit, that short-term profit, while people try and imitate, is the information and incentives that people should imitate. And so as a result of government taxes, in this instance, we will never gain C, D, and E as a society. So this is why we would want to allow people to make positive economic profit. This is one of the sort of, at least for me, a bit of a puzzle or conundrum. As a result of individual firms aggressively seeking positive economic profit, we would expect all firms in the market to be making 0 economic profit. But that's this dynamic process. And now we can sort of start modeling some of these things. And so now let's take a situation maybe 20 years ago with the Montana Association of CPAs, or Society of CPAs. And so we have, maybe what we have is a bunch of CPAs that have an individual supply schedule like this. And so in aggregate, this is their supply schedule. And we're in a competitive market and they're making 0 economic profit. Why would they want to restrict entry? Or alternately, they don't really restrict entry. What they do is they say the next generation of CPAs is going to have to go to school longer. So they're going to have a higher level of cost. They're going to have an extra year or 3 years or 7 years of schooling. And so what happens? Eventually, as time goes on, as typically populations increase and as incomes have gone up, demand has increased because many services are normal good. And so what is this? Now those Montana CPAs can make some positive economic profit as long as the new young people can't enter and compete it away. Now, normally they would enter. They'd say, look, there's positive economic profit over there. And so they would enter and compete it away, and we would expect to be at this price and this quantity. However, now that we have increased, maybe it didn't go up quite this much, maybe it only went up to maybe here, right? What happens now? Our aggregate supply schedule would look like that. And so now, once our demand schedule shifts out, we would now have this price. Oh, sorry. These two should have matched. I know this is a little messy. Hopefully you're tracking what I'm saying here. So maybe this is the young folks. And now, so we could actually, I'm going to have to redraw this to try and compare the situation in the accounting market as it stands currently. I think we can do this. Now, I know not everybody's interested in accounting, but I know some of you actually are in accounting, and so this might actually be relevant. So this was supply schedule before, and maybe now we had this before we were at this demand, but now, right? So now this was our demand, and yeah, that'll work. But no, we want some new CPAs because that's a realistic assumption, is that there's those of you who are studying accounting are going to go find jobs. So let's assume that. Okay, so this would be our new demand. And so what we would be comparing is the increase in demand without the restriction on entry and the increase in demand with the restriction on entry. So with the restriction, we end up here. Without the restriction, we would end up down here. And so basically, if we think about this, I'll just get rid of this. If we have, so consumer surplus with no restriction, that's going to be A, B, C, and D. Consumer surplus with the restriction, actually, let's do all of producer surplus, all of the before. Producer surplus is going to be 0, government is going to be 0, and total surplus is going to be A, B, C, and D. With the restriction on entry, consumer surplus now is just going to be A. Producer surplus now is going to be B. Government is going to be 0, and total surplus is going to be A and B. The change as a result of this, the change in consumer surplus is a loss of B, C, and D. The change in producer surplus as a result of this is a positive B. The change in government is 0, and the change in total surplus is negative C and D. So this is a case where the old generation of accountants are better off. They've gained B for producer surplus. The new generation, they spent a bunch more time in college and they're still making 0 economic profit, so you could make a clear case that they are worse off. And consumers are also worse off. So we as a society are almost certainly worse off as a result of this, but it also makes perfect sense why we have this policy in many industries. It's not just accounting, it is across the board. There's a whole lot of government restrictions, whether it's lawyers or doctors or nurses, right? Basically, I look at most of those. Of course, those regulations say they're to protect consumers. But in my world, what really protects consumers isn't government regulation or government bureaucrats, it's choice, it's options, right? That's why currently people are struggling at Amazon, is they're saying, look, I don't, right? Amazon's treating me like crap, but what other options do I have right now? If we had a vibrant job market, government regulations are almost never the deciding factor. So that's some ways to play with this. I may come up with some others. I suspect that hopefully that gives you some insight into how to play with this and what this piece means. I'm not going to answer the questions on the from the reading. That's your assignment for the next class, and then we hopefully can talk big picture about that, and then I will record a video going over how to answer those questions. Okay, we'll see you in class.